I started with this quote, "May you always live in interesting times." And I thought it was appropriate given the political context we currently find ourselves in. Donald Trump has changed things. He's changed the political landscape, as Dr. Chad talked about. He's interesting. Like he consumes all of our time, all of the media. We want to watch it. We want to learn more about him. I don't know about you, but when I open the paper in the morning, I find myself looking to see, is there an article about Donald Trump? And if there isn't an article, I'm secretly a little sad, right? Because it's kind of fun. And the reality of that is that he's dominating our political system. Well, there's one negative effect of that, is that because we're only talking about Donald Trump, we're not talking about what's happening outside of the United States. And I think we're missing a story, an important story, a story that speaks to Donald Trump and how this happened. We in America, we feel that we're unique, that there's something different about us, that we're the only ones struggling to understand how this individual, who at the beginning nobody said could win, is suddenly the nominee for one of the most powerful and historic political parties in the world. Well, I'm here to tell you, you're not alone. There are Donald Trumps popping up all over the world. In short, there's a lot of Donald Trumps around. And what's interesting is that Donald Trump was actually late to the World Donald Trump Party. Now, he's not going to admit that, right? But there are a variety of other people who've been playing this game for a long time. It's almost as if there was a global rainstorm. And instead of beautiful flowers bubbling up, Donald Trumps are bubbling up all over the place, except for in Canada, who recently elected Justin Trudeau. And if you don't know anything about him, you should read about him. I have a total man crush on Justin Trudeau. You should see the diversity of his cabinet, right? I mean, this is exciting stuff. But elsewhere, we're seeing lots and lots of Donald Trumps. Now, what do these global Donald Trumps have in common? Well, as Dr. Chad talked about, they're riding a wave of populist anger. They're angry at the economic system. They're angry at the political system. They're using very nationalistic rhetoric. Also, they're entertaining. They're larger-than-life personalities. Most of them are men. Not all. Most of them are men. And these men are not afraid to talk about their masculinity and their sexuality and their large fingers. They also are usually against immigration. That's one of the central campaign points, is against open immigration. And many of them are anti-Islam. So what we're seeing is this very, very interesting dynamic globally. We think it's just the United States. The reality is I think this is playing out at a systemic level. So what I want to do today is I want to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes introducing you to some of these global Donald Trumps, and then also explaining some of the global factors that I think help us understand how we've come to this moment. I'm also going to take you back in history ever so briefly and talk about another era that's very remarkably similar to what we're experiencing today. And that's before World War I. Very similar dynamics that I think help us understand what's playing out. But I know what you really want to do. You want to bring on the global Trumps. All right. So we need to start in the Philippines. The Philippines, a couple weeks ago, elected this guy, Rodrigo Duterte. He's a long-standing politician in the Philippines, but he's never risen to the high level of office of president, mayor, more lower-level positions. Now, what's interesting about him is that he uses very similar rhetoric or approach as Donald Trump does. So like many politicians, he talks about getting tough on crime. He's going to get tough on crime. Although he's talking about, like, killing criminals. I would kill all of you, insert F-bomb, making the life of the Filipinos miserable. So when he's interviewed, he's talking about killing common criminals. When he was asked by a reporter, what would he do if Congress impeached him? I'll close Congress. And I'll take all the money and I'll give it to the teachers, right? Always give it to the teachers. That's good politics. He regularly boasts about his sexual prowess. And in this rant, he was talking about his two girlfriends, right? He's got two girlfriends now. They're housed not in a condo, not in the houses in the Green Hills. They're in a boarding house. Just 1,500 pesos a month, right? So he's arguing he's got lots of girlfriends, and they're relatively inexpensive. That message, you couldn't say that years ago, right? It's interesting to understand that our global discourse about what's appropriate campaigning has changed. All right, and then the last comment. The Pope came to the Philippines. Anytime the Pope comes, there's going to be traffic jams. Duterte did not like this. And he called out the Pope, "Pope, you son of a bitch, go home. Don't visit here anymore." Very Donald Trump-like. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, global Donald Trump, President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, right? So we're seeing this is not just limited to the United States. We say, all right, Muck, that was 2 weeks ago. You got anything else more relevant? Yesterday in Austria just had their presidential elections, and they almost elected this guy, Norbert Hofer. So he lost the election. It was like 50.3 to 49.7. It was so close, less than 30,000 votes. Defeated this, a member from the Green Party defeated him, but it was so close. And why that matters, this would have been the first time since the Nazis that an extreme far-right candidate would have become a head of state. So they were that close to electing an extreme far-right party in Austria. Somebody else, when he initially ran, they said he has no chance of winning in Austria. Never gonna make it through the political process. Almost wins. His campaign, he ran on Austria first. He was going to stop the invasion of Muslims. And he was going to build a fence on Austria's southern border. Not a wall. He ran with fence. Semantic difference, right? So you see some parallels here, right? They're using the same type of arguments. And I would argue this is playing out across Europe. So Marine Le Pen is a candidate in France who many polls say that if the French presidential election right now were to be held, she might win. So she's been making far-right arguments for a long time. Popping up all throughout Europe, another prominent individual in the government of the Netherlands is Geert Wilders, who has made a number of anti-Islamic statements, arguing against open immigration, arguing against globalization, arguing against Islam. Not seeing any nuance or distinction between terrorism and Islam. Some of the language he used is very difficult, right? He compared the Quran. He said it's a fascist book which incites violence. That is why this book, just like Mein Kampf, must be banned. I mean, this is over-the-top rhetoric. I think what's interesting about this gentleman is that when you I mean, really? I mean, the ties, the hair. I don't know. I think there must be a club that certain individuals get invited to. All right, so when you think about Europe, what's happening is that the rise of the far right is being fueled by a similar type of rhetoric that we've seen in the United States out of Donald Trump. These are charts of the rise of the far right in Austria. And what you see is the more red is the more far right parties and their strength. And for many countries, it's trending up. Again, what forces us to think about what's going on, not just in the United States, but what's going on globally. All right, outside of the United States, Latin America is looking at us and like, really? You just think that Donald Trump arrived? We've had Donald Trumps for years. Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, Alberto Fujimori in Peru. They say this is something that we've dealt with for decades. Now, what's interesting about this is the Trump movement has been on the right. Populism in Latin America has been on the left. But I think it suggests that it doesn't have to be a partisan issue. You get candidates like this on both the left and the right. Interestingly, Brazil recently impeached their president, Dilma Rousseff, and the vice president, who now is going to take over, some think might move in the direction of Donald Trump. He's a right-leaning candidate and say that he has some tendencies. But my favorite case of Donald Trump in Latin America is the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. Like Donald Trump, he loves Twitter. I mean, he has Twitter wars all the time. He's known for trolling Facebook and Twitter to find those that are criticizing him. Just random people. And then he brings their names up at press conferences. So it'll be like if I said something bad about Obama, and then at Obama's press conference the next day, he's like, oh, Muck said all this stuff. He does this. He'll call people out from Twitter and Facebook. More recently, he had a Twitter war with John Oliver. So John Oliver had a segment on him, attacking him and his practices and the way he runs government, and he went to Twitter. And they've been going back and forth on Twitter. But I think the aspect of the example that captures him the best is this picture down here. It's a picture from a car camera. His presidential caravan was going through town, and they passed a little kid who flipped him off. Gave him the bird, right? Gave the presidential caravan the bird. He stops the cars, right? He gets out, and he runs up to the kid, puts his finger in the face, it's like, he starts yelling at him, and specifically says, show some respect, little kid. I'm your president, you rude scoundrel. Now, there's a couple things here, but who uses scoundrel anymore, right? I haven't heard that in a long time. All right, big picture here, though. As we zoom out, I think the reality is that we need to realize we're not alone in this dynamic. We're seeing global Trumps emerge. And the question is, what explains this? What explains this trend? Why are we seeing politicians run on platforms like this, not just in the United States, but globally? And I think what we're seeing here is, for instance, why do we see voters getting out of line and not being excited by the standard, by the status quo, but instead looking for the radical? And I think the reality is the line is long, right? So the line for the radical change and upheaval is long. The line for keeping everything basically the same is much shorter. So we need to ask, why? Why is this happening? Why are people, who's in this line? People who are angry about the economic system, those that are angry about capitalism, about globalism, but also those that are angry about globalization in terms of outsourcing of their jobs. There are some people that are angry about the political process. They feel like their voice isn't heard. There are those that are angry about the social dynamics, that they're not allowed to be who they are, to express their identity. That's constraining. There are those who are angry, who are in the line about religious behavior. ISIS is in the line, right? So they are rejecting. They want massive dramatic change. There are more moderate religious individuals around the world who are also arguing for change. So you have a situation where there's a lot of people who are frustrated, who feel like the economic, the political, the social, the cultural systems are frozen in place. They're stuck. And so when that happens, people are excited about candidates who want to change things. And I think that's why we're seeing people gravitate to candidates like Donald Trump. For me, what's really interesting is looking back in history and to look at the area, roughly 20 years before World War I, where there were some similar dynamics playing out. So we tend to think about the era before World War I as Downton Abbey, right? So great show, I love that show. Downton Abbey, where everybody had like fancy hats and they had tea, and it seems wonderful, right? No, prior to World War I, there was massive income inequality. There was a lack of political participation. People were frustrated with their political process, domestically and globally. There was an anger and a frustration with the social system. So this was the time of the temperance movement. So no alcohol. That'll make somebody cranky, right? The social systems were not allowing people to express themselves in a variety of ways, and there was this sense of social anxiety. There was also a global terrorist movement. They were called the anarchists. And in the 20 years prior to World War I, they killed 6 heads of state. So we've got a lot of violence, terrorist violence that plays out now, but 6 heads of state. Think about what that would do today and how fearful people would be. People were fearful at that time. And how that played out is there was a fear of foreigners. Countries shut down borders, less travel, less immigration. Judge those who live outside of your border. So think about that time period. Income inequality, political frustration, social coercion, global terrorism, a fear of foreigners, shutting down borders. I mean, it sounds a lot like what we're experiencing today. I think that should give us pause. I like to use the metaphor of an earthquake, right? So, and that helps us understand what's going on. So you've got forces like tectonic plates that are coming together, pushing against each other. And the question is, how is that going to play out? There's going to be an earthquake, but is it going to be a bunch of little earthquakes that the system can weather? Or is it going to be the big one? And when you think about global candidates, Donald Trump and others around the world, they're arguing for big change. And sometimes big change can be good, but sometimes it can be very dangerous. When World War I started, there was a sense of relief among many to say like, all right, good, at least now there's something's going to happen. There's going to be some change. I would argue that was a very dangerous change. So as we think about where our system is, both domestically and internationally, I think it's useful to think about finding ways to release some of those tensions, economic, political, social tensions, so that we don't have the big one, so that we don't fall off the edge of the cliff. But again, you're not alone. There's Donald Trumps all over the world. Thank you.